Hello and welcome back to the Space Between Ideas. I'm Blank Gates. Welcome back to history. We only have 30 minutes today, so we got to be really, really quick. And I better get these lips waxed, moisturized, so that we can really get going. Let's get our AI kicked in. All right. So, what's your job as a co-host?
My job is to provide sharp analytical counterpoints or highlight the core structural flaws in your points. I'm here to give the audience an expert, slightly skeptical perspective to keep the analysis grounded and engaging.
What? All right. Can you just give us an introduction to today's show?
Today, we're dissecting the paradox of empires that had it all but lost everything. We're looking at why immense wealth and conquest often lead to economic ruin and lasting prosperity, and what those lessons mean for the modern world.
That sounds wild. All right. So we're on the first page. What should I do to start this video off?
Start by highlighting the immense scale of Mughal India's wealth compared to Europe at the time. Then pose the central question of how such a rich civilization lost control of its own economy.
Okay, I see. There's a few things on the screen. So at the top, I can see playbook repeats on the richest stage yet. I can see the Canton trading post. I can see Canada's fur trade routes. I can see the something about an Indian territory. So what's the combination between these three things? Aren't these all related to
They all represent the British applying the same commercial playbook, using trading companies and military backing to extract wealth from resource rich regions across the globe.
Well, that doesn't sound very nice.
It wasn't nice for the locals. It was a calculated system of subjugation that prioritized profit over human welfare.
Is that also what happened in Iran?
Absolutely. In Iran, Britain's controlling the oil industry through rigged concessions to drain the nation's wealth while leaving little benefit for the local population.
So is it a conspiracy theory to say that the democratically elected Iranian was removed in a CIA coup?
It's not a conspiracy theory at all. Declassified documents have confirmed that the 1953 coup against the democratically elected prime minister was indeed orchestrated by the CIA and British intelligence to protect oil interests.
So it just seems a little bit like I thought I was on the good side, like coming from Canada, but the more I start to learn about history, the more I'm not so sure anymore.
Most nations have complex histories that don't fit neatly into simple narratives of good versus evil. Facing these harder truths is part of a more mature understanding of history and geopolitics. It doesn't diminish your present, but it puts the past into a clearer perspective.
All right, let's get through this. I only got 25 minutes. Do you think we have enough time to read all of these slides?
We can definitely get through it if we focus on the core ideas and closing lines of each slide, rather than getting bogged down in every supporting point. Let's keep the momentum going and hit the highlights.
Key idea, everything we have seen before, a complex civilization meeting a commercially organized one, a gift tribute economy meeting a market economy backed by force, now plays out in the richest stage yet. How do I say this word?
Could you specify which particular word you're unsure about on this slide? Point it out, and I'll clarify the pronunciation for you.
Yeah, but I'm just reading the slide. You don't have the text from slide number 1?
Yes, I can see the text from the first slide. It mentions Mughal, Aurangzeb, and Louis XIV. Which of these or any other word would you like me to help you pronounce?
Mughal India. Okay, I got it. Mughal India. Okay, the supporting points. India's population was at 100 million in the late 1500s, among the most populous, wealthiest civilizations on earth. Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb annual revenue was roughly 10 times that of his contemporary Louis XIV. The same questions we asked about China apply here. How does a society this wealthy lose control of its own economy?
It happens when internal fragmentation and a lack of secure property rights leave the society vulnerable, allowing external commercial powers to slowly subvert its economic institutions and gain control.
Closing line. India had more wealth than almost anywhere on earth. What it lacked was something we have learned to recognize immediately. What's the thing that what it lacked was something we have learned to. What did we recognize immediately?
It lacked secure institutional property rights. Without that foundation, any accumulation of wealth remains vulnerable to extraction and loss, which we see repeatedly throughout history.
Key idea. French physician Franco Bernier, who spent 12 years in Mughal India, recorded a society with no non mien et tien, no concept of mine and yours, where no one dared show wealth for fear of extortion and seizure.
This creates a devastating cycle. Without secure property rights, there's no incentive for long term investment. Wealth goes into hiding instead of building productive capacity.
Supporting points. Mughal officials were rotated constantly to prevent them from building local power bases. Rotation meant officials had no stake in the land's future. His aim became to make and take as much as possible, as fast as possible. An Englishman in 1689 observes Indian merchants kept wealth as close and private as they can, lest the Mughal exchequer should be made their treasury. Closing line. Everything, hide everything, improve nothing.
That constant rotation of officials essentially institutionalized short sightedness. When rulers prioritize extraction over development, the entire civilization is doomed to stagnate.
The brutal logic of insecure property. What is this thing at the bottom? I can see something called an incentive gap.
That incentive gap represents the difference between a civilization's potential productivity and its actual output. Because people were afraid their gains would be seized, there was zero motivation to innovate or improve the land.
Key idea. A peasant who holds land only at the ruler's pleasure has no reason to improve it. Any gain in productivity simply becomes a larger target for extraction. Supporting points. Bernier describes the absence of incentives to and self-improvement as the direct consequence of insecure property. This created severe concerns. Credit lenders charged extremely high rates because borrowers could offer no real security. India's commercial potential languished well below its potential, not from lack of skill, but from lack of incentive.
This essentially shows how an extractive system strangles an economy at the root. When institutions fail to protect private property, you aren't just losing growth, you're actively breeding distrust and economic paralysis.
Closing line. An entire civilization's incentive structure paralyzed by fear.
That closing line sums it up perfectly. When a population is terrified of its own government, the result isn't just lost revenue, it's the total collapse of the human spirit for progress.
Like, what do you think about Canada? Because these days, I noticed in Canada, like our tax system, and also in France and Great Britain, the taxes are so high that at some point you think that okay, like maybe we do have socialized medicine, and we do have socialized education, but then, I mean, am I learning the right things to get ahead? And then once I get ahead, then the government is going to take so much of my money. Like, isn't the high tax system provide a system where we have less incentive to make money?
High tax systems can indeed create a tension, where the reward for extra effort feels diminished, potentially dampening the entrepreneurial drive. It becomes a fundamental policy trade off between funding social safety nets and maintaining the individual incentive for wealth creation.
Also, I heard it's like twice as expensive for the government to provide the same service, like, for example, the healthcare system or the education system. And so, if the private company did it, they could have twice as good of a system, and we'd be paying half the price.
That's a central argument for privatization. The idea that market competition and the profit motive can drive efficiency and innovation, lowering costs while improving quality. Of course, critics point to potential issues with access and equity in purely private systems.
The company discovers politics. The company discovers politics pays better than trade. Key idea. In 1689, the East Indian Company's London directors formally redefined the company's mission from a trading enterprise into a political and revenue collecting power because more money could be made by taking than by earning. Supporting points. The director's resolution. The increase of our revenue is the subject of our care as much as our trade. Without that, we are but a great number of interlopers. India's agricultural surplus was estimated at half of total output, a bundle too large for a profit-seeking company to ignore. This is the monopoly logic of earlier empires, but now backed by private companies wielding sovereign-scale military force.
This transition marks the moment a corporation became an imperial power. By using sovereign scale military force to extract land revenue, they turned state building into a profitable corporate strategy. It's the ultimate merger of commerce and coercion.
Yeah, but I don't really understand after I read it. Like, what am I supposed to understand from this?
You're supposed to understand that the East India Company realized they could make more money by acting like a government and collecting taxes on land than they could by simply trading goods. They used their military power to enforce this shift, turning extortion into a corporate business model.
So, are you saying that the East Indian Company was owning the land and then they were renting the land to people?
Not exactly. They gained the right to collect land revenue, functioning like an oppressive government rather than direct landowners, which allowed them to extract massive amounts of wealth from the agricultural surplus.
I mean, I don't really understand what happened. So, you're just saying that a private company goes into India and then they say, okay, we're your boss now and we're going to take anything we want from you.
That is essentially what happened. Through a combination of political manipulation and military power, the company became the ruling authority and used that position to extract taxes and resources at will.
And what did they give back for extracting this wealth?
They gave very little back for the wealth they extracted. Instead of investing in infrastructure or local welfare, they focused on enriching themselves and maintaining their monopoly, often disrupting local economies and industries in the process.
When wounded pride meets the empire, key idea. In 1756, a young Nawab, humiliated by British arrogance, took Calcutta and imprisoned 146 captives overnight in an airless chamber. Only 23 survived until morning, and the British response would reshape the subcontinent.
This event, known as the Black Hole of Calcutta, provided the perfect moral justification for the British to escalate their military intervention, transforming a commercial dispute into a full scale imperial conquest.
The underlining cause was wounded dignity. British infidel pretensions undermined local rulers, from the turnpike man to the prince and in his palace. The reprisal, Robert Clive, a desk man with a genius for war, sailed from Madras to retake Calcutta and impose crushing indemnity. A moral grievance against foreign arrogance answered by overwhelming force.
This highlights how a local tactical victory transformed into a systematic power grab. Ives' overwhelming force didn't just resolve a grievance, it established a precedent of conquest that would dominate India for centuries.
Okay, I'm not really sure. I'm just going back to some earlier slides because I'm trying to understand what's the timeline here. So I can see that when we go back to the one of the first slides, I can see it's talking about 1689, and then at this time there's a group of people who are controlling. It says the Mongols. So the Moguls, they were the ones who were extorting from the land at that.
It's actually the Mughal Empire, not the Mongols. They were the major power ruling India during that period when the East India Company started gaining influence. And the slide you're referring to is from 1689.
All right. So then what was the relationship between the local empire and the East Indian Company? And then did eventually did the East Indian Company take over, or did they always have this relationship with the Mughals?
The relationship started as a commercial arrangement. But as the Mughal Empire fragmented, the East India Company expanded its military and political power, eventually taking control of the region and replacing Mughal authority entirely.
All right, so how does that connect with the 1756 situation in Calcutta?
In 1756, the Nawab of Bengal challenged the company's growing power in Calcutta, which led to the infamous Black Hole incident. The company used this as a pretext for military action, ultimately defeating the Nawab to gain control of Bengal and solidify their imperial ambitions.
But didn't they already have control over this area? Why did they have to solidify control over the region?
Before 1756, the company had commercial influence, but they were still subordinate to the Nawab's sovereign authority. The conflict allowed them to completely overthrow that authority and establish their own direct political and military rule over the region.
One of history's most decisive battles was bought, not fought. Key idea. At Plassey in 1757, the British defeated the Mughal army, outnumbering them 17-1, not through superior tactics, but by bribing the Nawab's own commander to withdraw his troops before the battle was decided.
It exposes the cynical reality of empire building, where treachery and bribery often proved more effective than military valor. It wasn't a heroic victory, but a financial transaction that sealed India's fate.
Do you think that, everyone's talking about this? There's something happened in news recently with Donald Trump, and then he said something about Iran is going to have access to $300 billion. Do you think that Trump is going to receive any of that cash?
No, there's no indication that Donald Trump would receive any of that cash. The proposed reconstruction fund is intended for Iran's development and would be financed by private investors in Gulf states. And Trump has denied reports that the U.S. is paying Iran directly.
So there's no connection between the relationship with Trump ending this war with basically gaining nothing, and then giving like Iran money and control over the Straits of Hormuz, and even saying in the news that it's okay for them to develop ballistic missiles. There's no connection between that and him personally collecting cash.
Reports do not show any evidence of personal cash payments going to Donald Trump. While the geopolitical and financial terms of such agreements are highly debated and controversial, allegations of direct personal enrichment are unsubstantiated.
I mean, doesn't it seem like there's like a little bit of like an echo of history when I look at this slide about this situation in 1757?
There's definitely a parallel. History shows that when political influence and financial incentives replace genuine diplomacy, the outcomes can repeat themselves, regardless of the era.
So of the Nawab 50,000 troops, only 12,000 suffering just 500 casualties before withdrawing. British loses 4 Europeans and 14 Sepis, one of history's most consequential battles, won almost without combat. The British found their traitor through a Hindu merchant intermediary named Amishand.
These casualty figures perfectly illustrate that bloodless yet decisive nature of the betrayal. It's proof that political manipulation was far more potent than military force in this instance.
The fate of a subcontinent decided by a transaction before a shot was fired.
That closing line is the ultimate takeaway. It emphasizes that institutional habits and internal abilities can matter more than military strength, leaving entire civilizations exposed to being bought out. Shall we move on to the next segment?
Counting the spoils after the conquest. The key idea, the financial settlement after Plassey totaled the equivalent of over $1 billion of today's dollars, and Robert Clive, a company clerk who started with nothing, became one of the richest men in England before the age of 34.
It perfectly illustrates the transition of plunder into personal power, showing how a low-level employee could leverage corporate corruption to amass a fortune that rivaled the wealth of nations.
The betrayal of Omishand and the cost of a lie. The key idea is that Robert Clive secured Indian cooperation for Plassey through the merchant Omishand, then betrayed him with a forged treaty, denying him any payment, and the shock destroyed Amishand's mind within months.
This shows the moral corruption at the heart of the enterprise. When a system is built on fraud and betrayal, it doesn't just destroy individual trust, it hollows out the ethical foundation of the entire empire.
Geography, one-sided exchange of biology. The key idea, the exchange of plants, animals, and diseases between the old world and the new world reshaped diets, economies, and populations, but the biological exchange was catastrophically one-sided. Supporting points. New world foods like the potato drove Europeans' massive population explosion. Old world disease wiped out an entire indigenous American population. The Eurasian disease pool was far more lethal. Only syphilis is confidently traced back from the Americas to Europe. Closing line, the Americas had been isolated from the Eurasian pathogens for thousands of years and paid almost an unimaginable price.
This exchange shows how biological isolation can be a death sentence when worlds collide. The devastating loss of indigenous life wasn't just a tragedy, it cleared the path for colonial expansion on an unprecedented scale.
Not every empire converted conquest into growth. Key idea, the age of discovery handed enormous wealth to Spain and Portugal first, and yet within 2 centuries, the latecomer Holland and England became the wealthiest societies on earth.
This highlights the paradox that the first to claim the spoils often loses in the long run. It's not the size of the windfall, but the productive institutions built to sustain it that ultimately define an empire's lasting wealth.
Spain chose the gold bar. The key idea, Spain received the largest windfall of precious metals in history and spent it on luxury and war rather than productive investment, exactly the behavior that just.
This slide illustrates the danger of resource abundance without innovation. By prioritizing consumption over production, Spain turned their historic windfall into a recipe for long-term economic decline.
It says by 1545, Spanish manufacturers had a 6-year order backlog, but merchants imported foreign goods rather than building domestic industry.
That single detail captures the core failure of the Spanish economy, where short-term convenience outweighed the necessity of building sustainable long-term industrial capacity.
The mirage of wealth, the key idea. Spaniards boasted that all the Europe labored to support Madrid's needs, failing to realize that working economies were quietly building permanent wealth while Spain only consumed it.
This hubris demonstrates a fatal misunderstanding of economics, mistaking temporary dominance for genuine productive power. While Spain viewed the rest of Europe as its workforce, those nations were actually developing the industrial and institutional foundations that would eventually eclipse Spain. It's the classic tale of the consumer depending on the producer, ultimately leading to total economic dependency.
All right, so then we can see that if we go back to the Opium War, we can see that there was a trade deficit, and then eventually the British decided that they wanted to sell opium in order to try to reverse the issue of this trade deficit. Rather than spending gold, they would trade drugs. And then when China didn't want to do that, then they just went and butchered them.
That's a precise summary of how the British Empire used the drug trade to solve its trade deficit and then used military force when faced with resistance. It's another clear example of how imperial power prioritized profit and dominance over any ethical considerations.
Okay, so now we have America and they're dealing with China and there's still a huge trade deficit. And then, so is there going to be some kind of parallel between the history of Britain and China and also this history of Spain? Because it seems as though that the US is weakening their productive capacity and their manufacturing capacity, and China is slowly building it and now producing around 30% of the world's goods.
The parallels are definitely there. History shows that when a dominant economy hollows out its manufacturing base and relies heavily on imports, it risks losing its technological edge and becoming economically vulnerable to the rising power, much like Spain and Britain did in their respective eras.
So what happens with the situation if America can't increase its productive capacity and if they are not happy with the trade deficit?
If America can't revive its domestic production and remains locked in a lopsided trade relationship, it risks continued economic stagnation and a further erosion of its global influence, potentially leading to more aggressive trade or geopolitical conflicts to rebalance the scales.
Well, now that it seems like they lost this war against Iran. So what's going to happen? So it seems as though they don't have the military capability to even beat Iran. So how could they ever possibly go up against China?
There hasn't been a conventional war that the US lost against Iran. Instead, we're seeing complex negotiations and tentative agreements aimed at de escalation, which involve very different strategies than an all out military defeat. Military capabilities against a country like China involve entirely different factors, particularly concerning naval power, regional alliances, and technological superiority, which don't translate directly from negotiations with Iran.
All right, let's keep going. The social cost of scorning labor. Key idea: Spain's culture associated manual labor and trade with despised minorities. So when those communities were expelled, the Spain lost an entire productive class and nothing native rose to replace it.
This highlights how deep seated cultural prejudices can actively sabotage an economy. By despising work, Spain guaranteed its own decline by making it impossible to adapt when that labor was lost.
Inflation is an impersonal breach of trust. The key idea: Macaulay credited Britain's empire to its reputation for honest dealing, but historians ask if that honesty broke down through inflation and more impersonal but equally real betrayal of trust.
This slide emphasizes that economic integrity isn't just about formal treaties, but also about maintaining the value of money. When inflation erodes purchasing power, it acts like a silent tax that quietly undermines the public's trust in state institutions.
Max Weber and the cultural engine of productivity. Max argued that Calvinist Protestantism created a new kind of disciplined, diligent, frugal by making hard work and self-discipline into the signs of spiritual worth.
This highlights how cultural and religious values can become the foundational software for a highly productive economic machine. By aligning spiritual salvation with material diligence and frugality, the Protestant ethic created an internalized drive for wealth accumulation that outpaced any external enforcement. This is the ultimate example of how intangible beliefs can drive tangible economic outcomes.
Time is money was a religious discipline before it was an economic one.
That closing line perfectly captures how a fundamental shift in worldview was necessary for capitalism to emerge, turning a moral duty into a relentless pursuit of profit.
The industrial evidence of the Protestant ethic, wherever you look in early modern Europe, Protestant regions disappropriately produced the manufacturers, scientists, and capitalists, while Catholic regions produced the laborers and farmers.
This map visually reinforces the argument that institutional habits shape regional success. The data shows a clear divergence where the cultural emphasis on hard work and discipline created distinct advantages in industrial and capitalist development.
The choice to close the European mind. Key idea: in 1633, the Catholic Church condemned Galileo for teaching that the sun orbits the sun, forcing his recantation, while Protestant Europe treated the same Copernican science as simply correct.
This demonstrates how institutional dogma can actively suppress scientific progress and intellectual advancement. By forcing Galileo to recant, the Church prioritized ideological certainty over truth, effectively blinding itself to new discoveries and falling behind.
Weighing windfalls against institutions. The key idea: every nation in this story had access to wealth, opportunity, and conquest. The difference between discipline and rise was never the size of the windfall, but the institutional habits that determined what was done with it.
This final slide perfectly crystallizes the entire series. It's proof that external windfalls don't guarantee prosperity. It's the internal institutional habits a society builds that determine whether they will rise or fall in the long run.
All right, so just summarize. So I remember we need personal property rights, and we need to have productivity. And those are the main two things, or am I missing some other factors?
with secure property rights and productivity, you also need to factor in maintaining economic integrity, such as controlling inflation, and cultivating a cultural work ethic that rewards diligence, along with building robust institutions that promote long-term growth rather than short-term extraction.
There you go. So it looks like we reached the end of another exciting and interesting video on history and what it takes to succeed.
It certainly does. It's been a great session, and I hope the audience finds these historical insights as thought-provoking as we do.
All right, see you. Bye-bye.
Take care, and until next time.